Good morning, ladies and gentlemen in the room and everybody who's joining us virtually around the world. On behalf of CropLife South Africa, as well as CropLife Africa Middle East, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today for our seminar that we're going to jointly explore the potential impacts that the European Union Green Deal could have on South African agriculture and particularly our export farmers. For those of you who are in the room, please, a little bit of housekeeping. If you can turn your phones off, please. If you have urgent need to remain connected and want your phone on, at least put it onto mute, please. You've all entered through the doors this morning, so if there is any emergency and we need to evacuate this room, calmly and slowly out the two back doors, out the glass doors, and we'll accumulate in the car park at the back, please. So thank you for that. It's fantastic the turnout we've got today. We have over 120 people who registered to be here face-to-face, and more than 250 people have registered and are listening to us virtually. So it's obviously a subject that's attracted quite a bit of interest. So thank you for your presence and your time. We do have CropLife Africa Middle East colleagues with us today, as well as the entire CropLife South Africa team. And we also have some of the CropLife South Africa EXCO members with us. So if you need to chat to us, there's quite a team here ready to handle your questions. I'm going to be the facilitator for the first session this morning, and we have a speaker who's still on the way from the airport, so when she joins us, she will come up and join me on the stage. Also, the facilitator of each session will give you information just before the end of said session in terms of tea breaks and the luncheon. So if you can keep your ears open for that, please. So I think that's enough of an introduction, but again, thank you for joining. We are going to kick off today's session with the welcoming introduction from Dr. Samira Amalal. Samira is our Director General for CropLife Africa Middle East. There's a big program being launched up in Morocco this week, so Samira can unfortunately not be with us, but she's pre-recorded our opening welcome for you. So we can move across to Samira's presentation, please. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Samira Amalal, and I am the Director General of CropLife Africa Middle East. I am only sorry that I am unable to join you in person today. Also, I would like to thank CropLife South Africa for the opportunity to address you today. Personally, and on behalf of CropLife Africa Middle East, who I represent, I welcome the opportunity to share our views and engage in what I am sure will be a dynamic day of discussions. CropLife Africa Middle East are committed to sustainable agriculture practices and to the responsible use of plant science technologies in the region. Our mission is to promote the understanding of the vital innovation, improvements, and benefits delivered by modern plant science products. We are convinced that these products and solutions developed and distributed by our members' companies are indispensable for farmers and society in the face of the increasingly complex and challenging global environment. And there is no shortage of challenge. The challenges that our agriculture faces in Africa, including here in South Africa, range from climate change, food security, water scarcity, inflation of fuel prices, trade and export uncertainty and restriction, and increasing impact of Europe regulation over how we practice agriculture in our countries and how we export our agricultural goods. Today, African farmers are on the front line when it comes to coping with and mitigating the effects of these multifaceted challenges, whether it's struggling to cope with increasingly unpredictable weather patterns, floods or drought, or the different pests or diseases increased by climate change. African farmers have the right to access all the innovation and technology, empowering them to face these challenges. Our industry also needs a supportive environment to innovate the potential solution modern science-driven farming offering in the fight against climate change and food insecurity. Moreover, our farmers also need both clear information, time, and resources necessary to manage the regulatory challenge that Europe is implementing to its markets. The Europe also need to better understand the impact both intended and unintended on its policy are having on African farmers. It is to these last 2 points that I now wish to turn my attention. In fact, the use of mirror clauses is hotly debated and divisive issue in the Europe politics. Mirror clauses describe when an imported product should be produced under the same sanitary, phytosanitary, and environmental standards as product produced within the Europe. CropLife Africa Middle East calls for mirror clauses to be compatible with WTO rules and based on solid internationally recognized science. Moreover, change to European minimum residue levels and import tolerances policies risk negatively impacting the African green transition. We share here a serious concerns for the potential revocation of import tolerance for any active ingredient not registered in the Europe. There is also concern for the risk that the future emeralds to be set with the new data point such environmental factors. Therefore, our call as CropLife Africa Middle East is advocating that emerald and the import tolerances policies be science-based and communicate as earlier as possible. These two prime examples of Europe policies impacting Africa farmers underline the crucial need for the European Union policymaker to not only focus on their own farmers and consumers, but also to better understand the specific challenges and the needs of African farmers, both from an environmental and trade perspective. Africa farmers not only require adequate transition period, but also significant technical and financial assistance to adapt their farming practice to evolving Europe standards. Also, the development of an access to viable alternative product and solution must be ensured in good time. Very important to note that removing pesticide without providing alternative will threaten food security and the resilience of farmers and consumers in Africa and also worldwide. In my opinion, policymakers and stakeholders from outside Africa overlook or misunderstand the necessity for specific technology and innovation required to address the unique pressure faced by African farmers from pest pressure, agricultural yields, or food insecurity. So major policy approvals such as those resulting from the Europe Farm to Fork strategy inevitably generate uncertainty, especially in sectors as complex as agri-food chain. Understanding the exact requirements and associated costs takes time and put farmers and businesses at risk. CropLife Africa Middle East has long been asking for additional investment and special emphasis on communicating in a timely manner, and the new requirements as soon they are known. Africa farmers must benefit from adequate and realistic transition period if we are to adapt and maintain access to the Europe market. However, African farmers need to do more, and we need to do it together. Is really now a time for all stakeholders involved in Africa agriculture to take our responsibility and make our voices heard, both at home and in Europe. If we do not do so now, then we will feel the impact in the next 5 years and have to live with the consequences for many years to come. And let me here be very clear. We are not talking about stopping the Europe Green Deal and farm to fork strategy. These trains have left the station. We are talking about raising awareness for our specific needs and the huge potential in intended impact on African agriculture. What we need really is are extended implementation periods, exception, support for transitional period and measures. This is where we need to focus our attention. And for that, we need to collaborate together as an industry and as also value chain to engage our national governments, ensure that our concerns have been heard. I know, Alain, you will be here from later today, and we will discuss this is in more detail. For the African continent to stand ready and to be heard, there is a key role for South Africa. You have key role to play as agriculture powerhouse and important global voice in your own right. And with the success story of GMO maize, my role also as in CropLife Africa Middle East will be to support CropLife South Africa to amplify its messages and voice and share this across the African region. One area also where South Africa can lead the way is in delivering research to help both South Africa and European policymakers to understand the potential impact of Europe policies on the South Africa agriculture sector. We urgently need to cooperate with our national researchers on data collection to quantify the impact of Europe policies on African productions, export, and food sovereignty. This data will help us to engage in more convincing fact-based talks with Europe policymakers and hopefully help us secure the specific support and exemption that we need. Definitely, we need also to ensure that we have an African green transition that supports local and regional community as well as trade. Technology can help farmers across Africa deliver more with less and embedded sustainable business development. In turn, that can drive more intra-regional agriculture trade and decrease dependence on import while simultaneously reducing carbon emissions. Unfortunately, this opportunity will be missed if we do not raise our voices and influence the policies that will shape our future. If I can make one request for today's conference, if we are to make our voice heard in Europe, then we need to strengthen our cooperation to amplify our voices. At CropLife Africa Middle East, we stand ready to contribute time and resources to help make this happen. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing about the discussion you will have today. Thank you very much.
So thank you to Samira, and just to repeat a few of the key points that Samira shared with us in the introduction. We are in no means attacking the European Union Green Deal. It is more a case of how are we going to mitigate the potential negative impacts on our market in South Africa, whether it's for local food production or for export. And you will see from the following presentations, that's exactly what we're aiming to do. Raise awareness about the potential risks and walking together down the road in the next year or so as to how we can mitigate those impacts that are potentially going to be quite significant for us. So I thank Samira for giving us that introduction and setting the scene as to our expectations of what we're all doing today. We're wanting to raise awareness, and we're wanting to hold hands going forward with this potential impact on our country. We're then going to move on next again to another pre-recorded message. Prof. Alan Matthews is the Professor Emeritus of the European Agricultural Policy at the University of Dublin Trinity College. And Prof. Matthews is going to give us a presentation on the EU Green Deal and what the expected impact on South African agriculture is going to be. If we can move on to...
Good morning, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation to address this conference and to speak with you today. I'm an academic, so I'm not here to represent the European Union or the European Commission. But what I'd like to do is to give you an overview of some of the developments in European agricultural policy in the recent period, particularly the greater emphasis now being put on sustainability and how this is likely to affect exporting countries such as South Africa, for whom the European Union is an important agricultural export market. Let me just emphasize, first of all, that the sustainability agenda in EU agriculture covers all three pillars of sustainability, so environmental, economic, and social. The environmental agenda is partly to reduce the environmental footprint of farming and also the food system more generally, for example, by reducing net greenhouse gas emissions, improving air quality through reducing ammonia emissions, reducing water use abstraction and improving the quality of water, reversing the decline in biodiversity, improving soil health, and in general, reducing the use of external inputs through a more circular bioeconomy. But also to promote the production of public goods. So, for example, paying farmers to create habitats for biodiversity, to store carbon in their soils and in vegetation, and to improve landscape and amenity more generally. Those are the environmental aspects of sustainability, but there are, as I say, also economic aspects, including income for farmers, helping farmers to manage risk, particularly important given the climate extremes that we're now observing, improving productivity, and improving the bargaining power of farmers in the food chain. And then a range of social issues. So, for example, concern over the number of farms, the size and ownership of farms, the issue of generational renewal, encouraging more younger farmers to enter the industry, improving animal welfare, the One Health agenda, and more generally improving and strengthening the vitality of rural areas. Specifically, with respect to agriculture, the Green Deal is reflected in what we call the farm to fork strategy. So, this was a strategy set out by the Commission, which contained a number of quantitative targets. And I've set these out here just to set the context. With respect to climate, the objective is that the agriculture and land use sector, so the AFLU, agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, would achieve net carbon neutrality by 2035, and thereafter would actually ensure negative emissions, carbon removals, which would offset some of the unavoidable emissions from other sectors of the economy. In terms of chemical use, the farm to fork objective is to reduce nutrient losses by 50% and to the use of chemical fertilizers by at least 20% by 2030, and also to reduce the use of pesticides by 50%. Although I have to admit, these percentage reductions are against a baseline which is somewhat unclear. Another objective is to increase the area under organic farming from around 8% at the current time to around 25% by 2030. In terms of health, the objective is to reduce the use of antimicrobials, particularly in animal husbandry, by 50% by 2030. In terms of biodiversity, the objective is to ensure that 10% of agricultural land will be devoted to non-productive features by 2030. So these would be landscape features like small areas of woodland, hedgerows, areas of scrub land, marginal land, which are not particularly valuable for agricultural production, but which can be really important as habitat for biodiversity. And finally, there are objectives around animal welfare, a commitment to introduce improved labeling, to encourage consumers to look for better animal welfare products, the transport of animals, increased space, and importantly, a prohibition on the use of cages for certain species, which the Commission has committed to introducing legislation for in the very near future. So now let's look at some of the potential impacts of these Green Deal measures for European agriculture, because this is where the linked market opportunities for exporting countries such as South Africa comes in. And there have been a number of empirical studies which have attempted to model what will be the impact on EU production if indeed these ambitious targets set out in the farm to fork strategy were to be achieved. And this table here summarizes some of the findings of these empirical studies. They're, of course, based on models and assumptions that lie behind these models. But I think the basic message is plausible and clear. Essentially, if we achieve the reduction in chemical nitrogen use, in pesticide use, if we set aside further land for nature, if we extensify production by increasing the area under organic farming, all of this is expected to lead to reduced production within the European Union. And you can see the specific numbers differ across the studies, but in general, the arrows all point in the same direction. So we expect overall reduced production in the European Union. Of course, as I've mentioned, it's not only on the production side. The farm to fork strategy also seeks to bring about a change in consumer behavior. And I've just a couple of slides here taken from a recent study which looks at the potential impact on the demand side if European consumers were to move in the direction of the well-known Eat Lancet diet. Now, I want to emphasize that this is in itself not a specific objective of the farm to fork strategy. It's not the objective that we should follow the Eat Lancet diet in detail. As many of you will know, this is quite a controversial diet, but it's illustrates the direction in which Europe would like to go. So reduced consumption of animal products and increased consumption, particularly of fruits, vegetables, and nuts. So what you see here are results from two different models, basically looking at three scenarios. So a reference scenario to 2030 and to 2050. And then a scenario called Scenario 10, which would lead to a 10% movement from, if you like, the baseline or the reference scenario towards a diet which is the same as the Eat Lancet diet. So a 10% movement, that's the first scenario, a 30% movement, and then on the final column on the right-hand side, what would happen if we were actually to achieve the full Eat Lancet diet in the European Union. And you can see the numbers are really quite striking, particularly the reductions observed for meat products, and particularly red meat, beef, but also the expected increase in consumption of fruits and vegetables. So basically, that's the pattern that we would expect to see, even if, as I say, the end result is not necessarily to bring about the Eat Lancet diet in totality. Looking then at the implications, if we were to achieve those kind of dietary changes in Europe, what would be the implications for trade? So this is ignoring any of the production changes that we've already highlighted. And you can see that, again, the three scenarios are emphasized across the top. You can see both imports and export trends for each scenario. And if you just focus on the imports, you can see again, depending on the scenario, that we would expect to see a drop in the import of meat products, particularly beef, into the European Union, given the dietary changes that are simulated here. But we would expect to see a significant increase in imports, particularly of fruits and vegetables. Indeed, if we were to bring about the full Eat Lancet diet, which of course has very limited animal products, it would imply, according to this study, around an 11 times increase in imports of fruits and vegetables. So let me just try to summarize the story so far. So when we look at the implementation of the Green Deal targets in European agriculture, the first round effects will be to increase demand for exports from third countries, including South Africa. partly because compliance with higher EU sustainability standards will lower EU production and increase imports, but also because the proposed dietary shifts towards greater fruit, vegetable, and nut consumption will also contribute to this increase in imports. Of course, there will be more general effects other than the direct impacts for exporting countries, in that lower EU production will contribute to higher global food prices, with potential negative impacts, of course, on food importing developing countries, while food exporting countries would expect to benefit. Of course, increased EU imports may lead to environmental degradation or the shift of pollution to countries where that increase in production is going to take place. It may also exacerbate social concerns in exporting countries. So there may well be a second round set of impacts arising from accompanying trade policy measures, which will then act as a form of non-tariff barrier, which would offset some of those first round effects that we have discussed. So let me now turn to look at what the European Union is proposing in terms of the trade policy measures that would accompany the Green Deal. Let's look first at the objectives of these trade policy measures. So partly to safeguard EU production capacity by ensuring that EU producers compete with imports on a level playing field. And of course, linked to that, to limit opposition to raising domestic sustainability standards and to head off calls for lower standards from an important producer group. So that's the, if you like, the protectionist motive, but there is also a sustainability motive. So to avoid the offshoring of the negative environmental consequences of EU consumption through existing or increased imports. So for example, if in the European Union, farmers are required to undertake measures that would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and if that raises their costs and results in lower production, if that production is simply replaced by imports from third countries, then of course those emissions will simply be transferred abroad. And from the point of view of the global climate, there is not necessarily any gain to be achieved. And thirdly, an objective of these trade policy measures is to raise global sustainability standards by leveraging access to the EU market to give a stimulus to exporting countries to also raise their standards in turn. If we look at the initiatives that the European Union has proposed in this area of the external dimension of the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, there's a wide range of measures. And these were signaled first in an important trade policy strategy document published by the European Commission in February of last year. This review called for a more assertive, yet open, but sustainable trade policy. So an important pillar of the policy is the emphasis on safe, secure, and sustainable supply chains. And as part of that, the Commission flagged that it would be looking to require imports to meet similar sustainability standards as those required of EU producers. This emphasis was reflected also in the CAP political agreement that I've mentioned already in July of last year. There was indeed an amendment from the European Parliament in those negotiations, which would have inserted into the basic legislation that imports should meet the same sustainability standards as European producers. In the end, that amendment was not accepted, but it was agreed that the Commission would bring forward a report, which is now available, it was published in June of this year, looking at both the legal but also the operational feasibility of introducing such reciprocity standards on imports. As part of the declarations attached to that political agreement, the Commission accepted or committed to undertake a review of pesticide import tolerances, and that's an issue I'm going to come back to in just a moment. But first, let me just indicate some of the other initiatives that the Commission has proposed. For example, the proposed regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, published in November of last year. Again, I'll come back to talk about that in just a moment. For industrial products, there is a proposal to introduce a so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this would reflect the fact that industrial products within the European Union face a carbon tax through the emissions trading scheme that is operated. And the intention is that imports of initially a limited number of industrial products would also be required to pay a similar charge to European producers. Already there has been introduced in what's called the veterinary medicines regulation an antibiotics mirror clause. So this basically extends or requires imports of meat products to meet with a number of the standards that European Union producers must obey. The two issues here are, first of all, a ban on the import of meat products that have been produced using antibiotics as growth promoters. So if a country is accepting the use of antibiotics, as I say, as a method of promoting growth in animals, that meat will no longer be acceptable on the European market. Furthermore, the European Union is proposing that a limited set of antibiotics, which are deemed to be really important for human use, should be reserved for human use. And again, if those are used in animal husbandry in an exporting country, the European Union will not allow such meat to be introduced into the European market. That mirror clause is currently in force in the legislation, but hasn't actually been implemented yet because it's still depending on a set of delegated acts to actually bring it into force. There's a proposal for a sustainable corporate due diligence directive, which would oblige particularly larger companies to assess the risk of environmental and social harm in their supply chains and to take steps to mitigate those risks. There is a review of trade and sustainable development chapters in the European Union's free trade agreements. I've already talked about the review of animal welfare legislation and the proposal for this regulation on sustainable food systems at the end of next year. I want to just take up two of these legislative initiatives in more detail. And the first is with respect to so-called mirror clauses. Let me talk a little bit in more detail about one of those important initiatives, which is the introduction of mirror clauses. An early example is the ban on imports of hormone-treated beef. I've just talked about the ban on meat treated with certain types of antibiotics. But let me refer to what the Commission is proposing with regard to changes in maximum residue limits for pesticides, and linked to that import tolerances. And there are three issues that are under discussion. The first is the Commission has committed to a review of maximum residue limits for active substances that are banned in the EU because of the hazard-based criteria in the pesticides regulation. So basically, this refers to active substances that are deemed to be carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic, basically for reproductive purposes, and which are simply not allowed in the European Union. And regardless of whether there's a risk assessment or not, the European Union is proposing to set the maximum residue limits for these products to zero. Also significant is it is committing to assess the environmental impacts when setting maximum residue limits for active substances that are banned in the EU. So currently, if a substance is banned for health reasons, then it's already the case that the MRL is set to 0. But until now, environmental impacts, which could be a basis for banning the use of the substance in the European Union, these environmental aspects have not been addressed when setting the MRLs. The Commission is proposing to change that, and indeed is already proposed a draft regulation with respect to two neonicotinoids, which are banned for outdoor use in the European Union because of the damage to bees and to pollinators more generally. And these would now the current MRLs follow in a number of cases the Codex standards, so they are not set to 0. And the Commission is proposing to do that. So basically, there would be a 0 tolerance for pesticide, for residues of these two neonicotinoids on imported products. Now, the Commission is saying that import tolerances could still be set on a case-by-case basis if the applicant provides scientific evidence that the use of these neonicotinoids does not adversely impact pollinators in the exporting country. But this would be something that would have to be established. It would not be automatic. Note that there is some demand within the European Union that even this case-by-case opt-out would not be allowed. That if indeed a substance is banned in the European Union, products that have been produced with the aid of that substance in the exporting country would also be prohibited. But that's not what the Commission is proposing at the present time. It is allowing for this let out in terms of import tolerances. Another important initiative, although I suspect less applicable to South Africa, is the mandatory due diligence proposal for forest risk commodities. This will require operators to ensure that products such as soy, beef, palm oil, cocoa, coffee, and so on, that are placed on the EU market have not been produced on recently deforested land. As I say, I suspect this is not particularly relevant to South Africa, so I'll leave that to any questions that may come later. So to summarize the key messages of my talk, we know that planet Earth is suffering, that food systems must meet the triple challenge of ensuring food security, providing livelihoods, while protecting health and the natural resource base on which future food production depends. As I've argued, the first round impacts of Green Deal policies will be to increase market opportunities for exporters, particularly for fruits, vegetables, and nuts, and where I think South Africa has real possibilities in the future. But there will be these indirect impacts through the requirements to meet higher import standards. And these are clearly a non-tariff measure that will raise trade costs, reduce trade, but potentially, of course, improve environmental outcomes both in Europe and abroad. Ideally, one would like to see multilateral agreements around these issues. They are the gold standard, but often we observe that they reflect the lowest common denominator and often lack effective enforcement provisions. And hence the move by the European Union to introduce these more autonomous or unilateral measures. Import standards, of course, suffer from the fact that they are one size fits all. They don't account for differences between exporting countries. But it's clear the EU can be pressed over, for example, the length of transition periods that it allows and the extent of financial assistance that it is willing to provide to low-income producers. Let me stop at this point, and I look forward to any questions that may come subsequently in the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
So thanks to Prof. Matthews for that really interesting overview. I think the key messages you need to take out of that is the amount of legislation that is following on after the EU Green Deal. It's not just the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy. There's a whole bunch of EU legislation that is going to impact anybody who wants to export produce into the European Union. And I think you made it very clear that the risk of the mirror clauses to exporting countries, what we're going to face with that, particularly with the revocation, potential revocation of MRLs and import tolerances, which we'll be exploring as we go along. For those of you who have joined us virtually, please remember you can ask your questions in the chat function. Type in your question on the chat, and when we get into the discussion session shortly, we'll be able to see your questions and answer as many as you can. I'd like to welcome Dr. Tracy Davids up to the stage. Tracy is Director and Manager of the Commodity and Marketing and Foresight Division of BFAP, which is the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. And Tracy is going to chat to us about the EU Green Deal and how it will impact on South African agricultural exports. So please join me in welcoming Tracy up onto the stage. Hi, Tracy.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy I could at least attend in person. It did involve an early morning flight, but luckily they managed to get us here in time. So I've been asked to talk about the trade implications specifically for South African exports. It's a presentation that I've prepared together with a previous colleague, Dr. Tanash Kapuya, who's now with AGRA. I think like any true economist, we'll give you a whole lot of information, many alternatives, without necessarily giving you a straight answer as to what exactly we think the impact would be. But I think it's important to note that it's early days for that. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty around many of these mirror clauses, how exactly they will be imposed, the levels at which, the timeframes over which, and all of that, of course, influences impact. So not having that information, we opted for a bit more of a sensitivity type analysis. But I think to start, just to contextualize what impact might be, I guess it's worth just having a look at the trade data. What do we export? Where does it go? So what you can see on screen currently is South Africa's agricultural exports over time. It's plotted here from 2002 through to 2021. You'll note the line there in 2010, the big jump in exports. It's not too much to get excited about. It's more of a change in how data was reported. So this is when South Africa started reporting SACU exports as well. So that's the reason for the distinction. And also the reason why I did the growth rates post-2010, just to account for that. So if you just look, total agriculture and food exports growing by about 2% per year since 2010. Asia, the fastest one at 5%, and EU coming in second at 3%. So I think that's an important distinction to make. It is obviously an important market for us. It has also been a growing market. Of course, other ones are also still positive. If you look at North America, 2%, Africa's fairly flat, and then the rest of the world grouped together also just under 3%. If we take a different view of that, South Africa's agriculture and food exports, if you just take an average over the last 3 years, what does it comprise? This is what we're showing now. So there you have the top 15 products. And I think from that, it's quite clear that we'll talk a lot about fruit today. So if you look at the big contributors, citrus, wine, grapes, palm fruit, the top 4. And then just a little bit down, nuts as well. So there's a lot of fruit products in that. Of course, these are also perishable products. And these are markets that are also highly dependent on trade. Just in terms of where it's going, there you can see that around 30% currently, 32% is going into the European Union, another 13% into the UK. The one that's been growing is the 22% in Asia. But I think from that, it's quite clear that Europe is still a very solid market for us. And I think maybe not where we're directing most of our growth strategies, but certainly a market that we need to protect and look after. So the question then is the Green Deal and the associated legislation and clauses that are still coming, is that an opportunity for us or is it a risk, speaking specifically now to fruit exporters? And I don't aim to ignore the rest of agriculture, but I think from a trade perspective, this is where our important industries lie. So maybe just looking firstly at the opportunity, I think if you look at the early analysis, the empirical work that Prof. Matthews also showed earlier, there is scope for additional imports into the EU. It is likely that they will import more products, and if you look at the product mix, it's also likely that a significant share of that will be fruit and vegetables. If you contrast that to South Africa's product mix that we export to the EU, so a very similar graph to the one before, but now only looking at products going into the EU, it's clear that there's quite a good match between what they'll be importing and what South Africa can provide. So if you look at our top 10 products, for instance, we've got 7 of those are fruit products. And then if you consider the graph on the right, that focuses on citrus. Obviously, it's the biggest one, so it's a bit of a case study in many of the slides that I'll show today. It also tends to be a higher value market for us. So obviously this differs per product. It depends on the product mix, for instance, within citrus that goes into the various markets. But I think more broadly, if one wants to generalize, the EU market is a solid one. It's normally quite a high-priced market compared to many of the other alternatives. So this is all good news. This suggests that there is opportunity, but of course then one needs to be able to comply with the legislation that we know is coming. So there's always a catch. From a risk perspective, these industries, I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone here, are very export driven. So if you just look at the chart on the left, that shows the market distribution by volume for our various fruit products. The lines I've drawn in there is just for some context, so it's 50% and 70%, and there you can see that a significant share of them export in excess of 70% of the products. Others around half, and if you were to replicate this in value, those shares would be even higher because of your export market is typically your higher value share output. So these industries are very dependent on exports. If we need to divert volumes from exports back into the local market, typically comes at a reduced price, and it's a much smaller market, so if you flood it with volumes that typically would be exported, you depress those prices very quickly. On the right-hand side, this is a different perspective to that, so it's just looking at the various industries and how concentrated they are in the EU. This obviously is a key indicator of risk, so you've got things like subtropical fruit that's predominantly avos, grapes, stone fruit, all 70% and higher going into the EU market. So this obviously is products that would be, I would argue, maybe more at risk from the impact if you lose market share. And then you've got something like citrus is only 40%, so that's a bit more diversified, but still significant volumes going into the EU. So this is just another perspective to look at it in terms of where the risks would be and what they might entail. So some broad considerations, without repeating what Prof. Matthews said. I was very happy that he summarized all the legislation that goes with the Green Deal. To us, there's 2 broad aspects that you need to consider. So the one is the move to carbon neutrality, which is less of a focus today. So of course, if you think carbon neutral supply, you think shorter supply chains, local sourcing would make that easier. But then when you get to products that are perishable, like fruit and veg, you've also got seasonality to consider. So if you want consistent supply, then you'd be bringing those products from further in the off-season. The contrast to that, where it's possible, is cold storage, which in itself has a carbon implication, right? So one needs to offset those against each other. And then also the question is, how neutral can international trade be? So there's obviously many links in the supply chain, from farm through pack house, transport to the port, in cold storage, shipping to the new market, cold storage on the other side. So there's many aspects to that, but one, I guess, that always comes to mind is shipping, right? So this obviously does emit a fair amount. But if you just look, I pulled this from the Maersk website, which is obviously one of our big shipping companies. So they're aiming to have the first carbon neutral liner in operation next year, which is well ahead of the targets that they'd initially set themselves, with 60% by 2030 and complete coverage by 2050. So of course this, when one starts accounting for carbon through the value chain, helps you to mitigate some of those effects. The question is, how do you equalize on that front? Is probably through something like a carbon tax, and then the question becomes, can producers and exporters afford to add that on top of an already rising cost structure? The other side, which is more the focus of today, is this reduction in chemicals, pesticides, fertilizer use. Of course, this affects competitiveness, volumes produced, volumes traded. This creates, in theory, an opportunity for South Africa, but as I said, then we would need to comply. So the question becomes, can we comply, and at what cost can we comply? The last one is, of course, that there may be opportunities for organic production, but this in itself has time periods associated. You need to produce for 3 years, for instance, before you can be certified. So there's also aspects related to that and cold treatment and how it affects that, etc., to consider. So I think the most of today's focus will be on the middle one, and the bottom line with that is we will face additional technical restrictions. We don't know exactly what they will look like, at what levels they will be imposed, to what extent they'll consider the heterogeneity between production systems, different countries, different products. But if we want to keep that market and expand it, we'll need to comply with that. So then the question we asked ourselves was, what can we learn from the past? Because we have had some changes in the past. If you just think of things like in the citrus industry, the citrus black spot protocols, the false codling moth protocols. And historically, we've been able to deal with them quite well. If you look at our trade into Europe, there we're just showing the line plot is the value of exports into Europe over time, and then the share in total mix. So if you look at that picture, and at aggregate level, that share, it declined a bit earlier and then has sort of stabilized. We've seen good growth in value, even in US dollars terms over the years. And we've seen some products, if you look to the right, that just depicts individual product shares of the EU in total exports. We have seen some of them decline a bit. We've seen others increase. So this is where we get the net effect. But many of those products are still growing into that European market, despite very stringent SPS regulations. So I guess that says something for our producers in how adaptable they are, resilient they are, and in being able to comply with this changing environment. If we just focus for a minute on citrus by itself, this is an industry, as I said, that has significantly navigated changes in the past. I mentioned the citrus black spot regulations, the protocol associated with that. It was 2012 or 13 when the EU informed South Africa that they would stop exports if we had more than 5 CBS interceptions in a year. So we took this sort of as a case study and said, you know, if one looks at that and the effect on trade shares, again, of Europe in total product mix of the various citrus products there, it's only grapefruit that has declined a little bit, and others have grown significantly. So again, saying that our producers have been quite good at adapting and adjusting. Also, if you look at the trade growth in the table on the right, there we're showing growth, average annual rates in exports to the EU and also to the rest of the world. So sort of a comparative growth rate prior to that period, so from 2002 to 2013, and then after that period from 2014 to 2022. And most products are doing better. So of course we have also had significant increase in volumes, in citrus production volumes. So one would expect growth, but if you look at the relative sizes, we have done well in that market. The reality is that it comes at a cost. So last year we did a study for the Citrus Growers Association looking at the cost of complying with the CBS and FCM control measures, and that was in excess of 3 billion to the industry in a given year. So it does come at a significant cost for our producers to meet that. The risk that we see, and what I would like to highlight, is that the industry now is not quite in the same position as what it was 10 years ago. So when one thinks about absorbing additional costs and making additional investments, it is sitting in a different environment, many of our fruit industries, than what they were a decade ago. So on screen, we're just showing area and volume increases over the past decade, stacked on top of each other for the various fruit types. I think it's quite a clear picture. There you can see 40% increase in area under these commodities, very rapid growth. Volumes at 29%. There was some initial impact from the drought, of course, which skews this a little bit. But the other side of it is that there's a lag for products to reach full production. And we know that in a lot of these products, we've got a big share of the national orchard still young and not yet at a full bearing age. So what this would suggest is, as we go forward, there's additional volumes still coming into the market. And we've started to see the impact of that if one looks at price movements in the last year or two. On top of that, if one thinks horticulture, 2022 was probably one of the most difficult years to date. That's partly because we've seen this volume growth, which is depressing prices, but it's also because we've seen a lot of external factors that have influenced the industry. So the industry is about 30% of South African agriculture, but if you look at the gross revenue charts plotted there, we've got agriculture as a whole and horticulture. It was for a long time by far the fastest growing subsector in agriculture and a big contributor to growth that we saw in the sector. But then it's clear also in the last few years that that's flattened off. Last few years being post sort of 2017, of course there was the drought in there. And the last 2 years, that has actually turned around and declined. So going forward, there is some increase as these additional volumes come. It's volume driven more than price, but this doesn't account for costs here. This is just revenue. So I guess that's the concern. Many of the factors that influence it, we know COVID, the response to COVID initiated significant shipping logistics challenges in terms of costs, in terms of reliability. We've had the war in Ukraine, which of course is pressing down on economic growth prospects. It's also resulted in high energy costs, very rapid inflation, all of which is influencing the spending power of our consumer. And when we've got significant additional volumes coming into the market, that is having a price effect and is expected to have a price effect for a few years to come yet. This is indicated on the left. So there we've just plotted, it's just in index form, so all expressed relative to 2019. How prices in the various fruit products have moved over time and are expected to move under our baseline assumptions. So our baseline outlook was launched in August this year. So it accounts at least to some extent for some of these external influences that we've seen. There it's quite clear that prices, those are nominal prices, so they're flat for some years and then they start increasing a little bit again over the outlook. If you contrast that on the right to some cost indices, there you can see that the big spike is fertilizer, but also labor costs increasing over time, then it's clear that your producer's increasingly becoming squeezed. And this is important when one considers impacts of a trade legislation that would come on top of the situation that we find ourselves in currently. So in South Africa, we haven't seen large-scale empirical studies with respect to estimating influence. We have a simulation modeling framework at BFAP, so we've played around with some numbers, but as I said, it's more of a sensitivity analysis. I think one requires a much broader, fuller study to really inform what the assumptions are and what you introduce into the model. This is just in citrus, oranges in particular, which is our big citrus market. If one were to increase EU exports by 10%, the price impact that we simulated. So we start with a positive one. It's always a good place to start, right? So over time, looking at a roughly 5% increase. So this is just an average export price. It's an aggregate level. So within that, you'll have increases in some markets, decreases in some markets to give you this aggregate effect. As I said earlier, there are restrictions coming. So firstly, the question is, are we able to comply? Are we able to comply also with existing regulations, things like CBS and FCM? We need to control that, so we've got measures that we have to comply with. Can we still do that if we have to reduce pesticide and fungicide use significantly? And then the other side, if compliance is possible, at what cost does it come and can that cost be absorbed? So then we played around with some numbers on the negative side. So if we sit with some product that doesn't make it into the EU, that doesn't comply, what is your price impact if you start removing that from the EU market? Of course, that's going to push EU prices up because you're limiting supply, but then you're needing to push that product into alternative markets. So at an aggregate average level, you're getting a negative price impact in terms of export prices. So if you remove 10%, you're looking at 5-6% reduction over the outlook period. If you remove 25%, that comes 12-13, and if you remove 40%, that becomes around 20% in terms of price impact. So this is a full market model. We introduced this very abruptly. We did put it in 2023 and leave it. So you do get some response from producers over time. You get area coming out and volumes reducing as a result. It's also the reality that things that do get imposed would likely be phased in over time. We felt we'll show the impact like this, which is the most extreme, right? But if this gets phased in over a few years, the picture would also look a little bit different. Of course, citrus only exports 40% into the EU. So then the question was, what if we look at something else? So we picked table grapes as the next biggest one for the next guinea pig. There goes 70% into the EU, and there you can see how much more drastic the price effect is. So if you just remove 10%, you're looking at an excess of 20% reduction in price, because if you remove some of that volume from the EU, it's a very significant additional amount that you're pushing into other markets, which then has a price effect in those markets. At the bottom there's just the pie chart that shows where the market space is for grapes. That's table grapes and dried grapes, but the table grapes, of course, is the biggest share of that. So the other side is to look at producer level. This becomes even more hypothetical in nature because what we've got here is a simulation based on an industry average. Again, citrus, and we don't have anything against the citrus industry, it's just the biggest one, so it's where we're showing impact broadly today. Across regions, across enterprises, you'd see a lot of heterogeneity. So this average farm doesn't really exist. It's just an indicative measure. So I think I wouldn't read too much into the absolute values of volumes of or values of decline, rather to look relative to each other, how they are. So we played with two scenarios here. Both reduce the cost of chemicals by 50%. Because we're going to use less. So if we say that we cut by 50%, we remove that cost. But then, of course, it has implications. So either you're going to export a lot less because you're going to have a lot less product complying with export standards. So that's scenario one. And that product then ultimately ends up in the processing market at a much reduced price. And there you can see how severe the negative impact is on margins per hectare. Scenario two then says, okay, well, is there additional things that we can do to mitigate this effect? So here we went for quite a significant additional labor component to increase monitoring and sanitation, etc., to try and safeguard some of that product, so to still be able to get more product of expected quality to be able to access that export market. Of course, again, there's a cost associated with that, and there's also a yield loss associated with that. So that's the green bar. So it's clear from that if you can protect the market to some extent, you're better off, but in both of these, you're worse off than in the baseline where you never had these regulations to begin with. So just before I wrap up, just a last thought. Obviously, when you start thinking, if not the EU, then what? So if we need to look for alternative markets, this shows GDP, so middle class population in various regions on the left. So I think it's no secret that the industry has long looked to Asia in terms of growth. The reality is that we still have work to do there in terms of broadening our market access, but also of making it competitive. So the table on the right just shows preferential trade agreements in those Asian markets that South Africa has relative to its competitors. So if it's green, there's some preferential tariff rate. If it's red, there's not. And I think that's quite clear that many of our competitors are better off than ourselves in those markets. This is not to say that we're not doing it. I think there's a lot being done in the industries to improve that situation. But the reality is that we need to look after the EU market. It is a strong and reliable market for us. And if we lose it, we would in most industries be in quite significant trouble. So just to conclude, I think it's been said many times, there are trade regulations coming. So there may be an opportunity for additional trade. But if we can't comply with standards, then there's also a significant risk to our export volumes and in the sustainability of many of the investments we've made in the horticulture sector over the past decade. The magnitude, the time frame, how exactly things get imposed is still a bit unclear to us. That's why we never took a definitive view. We rather showed you a range of options. I hope that at least gives you some food for thought and informs some discussions. It must be said the EU has a history of very stringent SPS protocols. We have always managed to comply and to adapt, and I think that says something for the resilience of our sector. But as I noted, we are in a bit of a different position now than what we were 10 years ago, and that will likely also influence our adaptability. Just as a last thought, I think it was highlighted in the previous presentation, it's not all about horticulture, it is a lot about horticulture, but there's also some indirect effects. You know, there's industries like wheat, like canola, where the EU is a big player, and if those production volumes get reduced, there'll be world price implications there as well, which will affect obviously our imports and also our exports of some of those products. So I'll just leave you with this thought from Darwin to say it's not the strongest nor the most intelligent that survives, but the one that's the most adaptable.
Thank you, Tracy. Will you stay with me for the Q&A, please? Thank you. I think for the South Africans, Charles's quote there could also be a boer maak 'n plan, so I think we're going to get things right. Thanks, Tracy. So Tracy will stay on the stage with me for the Q&A that's coming shortly. Next, we're having a pre-recorded message for us from Dr. Wibke Meyer. Wibke is the Director of our Regulatory Affairs for CropLife International, and Wibke's expertise is on MRLs. So she's going to be talking to us now about the future outlook for MRLs and the impact that the EU Green Deal on MRLs might have for our South African exporters. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wibke Meyer. I'm Director of Regulatory Affairs at CropLife International, and I have the pleasure to speak today about the future outlook for MRLs and the impact of European Union policy on maximum residue limits in South Africa. I'm joining you virtually. I hope that in the future there will be the possibility that I can join you in person again, but I hope, we have a good interaction today. To quickly introduce CropLife International, we are the global federation representing the plant protection and the plant science industry. We are made up of 6 member companies that research, manufacture, and sell crop protection and plant biotechnology products. The organization also serves as a global network of regional and national associations, and we span more than 90 countries. We are the global network and the voice of leading advocates of the plant protection industry. We champion the roles of agricultural innovations in crop protection and plant biotechnology to support and advance sustainable agriculture. But today I will talk about European Union policy, especially about the Green Deal and the MRL policy. So the European Green Deal is a set of policy initiatives by the European Commission with the overarching aim to transforming the European Union's economy for a sustainable future. There are a number of key initiatives that you can see here illustrated, and there are some that are more important for agriculture, such as the Farm to Fork strategy, the biodiversity strategy, and the chemical strategy for sustainability. Today, I will focus on specific elements of the Farm to Fork strategy, namely the MRL setting procedures. But in general, the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy are to reduce the environmental and climate footprint of the European Union's food system, to strengthen its resilience, and to ensure food security. The European Commission also wants to lead a global transition towards competitive, sustainable farm to fork, and they want to tap on new opportunities. The European Union stated that they will pursue the development of green alliances on sustainable food systems. They will include sustainability chapters in all European Union bilateral trade agreements, and they want to promote their farm to fork objectives in international standards and in the relevant international bodies. So therefore, the European Farm to Fork initiative clearly has implications for trading partners and for every country actually that trades with Europe or is participating in international bodies. We all agree that food systems need to be more sustainable, but how to get there, I think that requires a lot of discussion. The European Union has put with its Farm to Fork policy its proposal forward, but in our view, there is not one size that fits all. Different regions have different needs, And we need a debate on how we become more sustainable in our food systems internationally and not only in the European Union. Therefore, we need a holistic view of potential negative and unintended trade-offs globally. And we also need to make sure that food security is a global policy priority, which is non-negotiable. Therefore, we are trying to foster dialogue between the European Union and its trading partners and trying to help the European Union moving away from unilaterally imposing trade barriers. We want to illustrate this at one of the key initiatives that the European Union has launched. When they announced their farm-to-fork policies, they clearly stated in their communication that going forward, they want to take into account environmental aspects when setting import tolerances for pesticides that are no longer approved in the European Union. It was not clear for almost 2 years how they would implement that, because they also stated that they want to be compliant with World Trade Organization legislation and procedures. But before I explain what the European Union has now is in process of implementing, I first would like to put us all on the same page of what is an MRL. What are the purpose of MRLs? Maximum residue limits are the concentration of pesticides residues that are legally permitted in or on food commodities and animal feed. The MRLs are based on good agricultural practice data. That means they are based on the registered uses in the countries, and that is what is mentioned on the pesticide labels. MRLs are therefore for checking whether the crop protection product has been used according to the label instructions in the respective countries. Because pesticides are used differently in different countries, because there are different crops, there's different pest pressure, different farming practices, MRLs can vary between different countries. And therefore, because they are used to check whether a pesticide has been applied correctly, if you want to trade your food, then you need to make sure that you register your MRL level also in the country with which you want to trade. And that is then called an import tolerance. So an import tolerance is the maximum residue level that is set on the uses registered in a foreign country in order to allow the import of treated commodities from abroad and to facilitate international trade. So MRLs have several functions. In international trade, they ensure that the food is safe for consumption and therefore can be imported into a country. And it's also an easy tool to check if the pesticide was used correctly. And therefore, if the product can be placed on the market. Primarily, the MRL are trading standards. And now, but with the European Union now stating that they want to also consider environmental factors when setting MRLs, that is moving away from internationally agreed principles. As I mentioned before, MRLs are set to facilitate trade and to protect the consumer health. Environmental aspects are considered in the registration of the pesticide when they are registered for use in the country where they are used. They are analyzed by the competent authority that knows the farming practices in the country, that knows the needs, the pest pressure, and that knows also the environmental conditions where the pesticide is used. Moreover, MRLs are not an appropriate tool to address global environmental concerns because the level of residues on a harvested crop does not correlate to the safety for non-target species or the local environment. Now the European Union, they are testing now their new procedure, and they have setting the precedent. Over the summer, they have announced to their trading partners via the World Trade Organization, the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, that they want to lower the MRLs for 2 neonicotinoid substances to the limit of quantification. They have cited concerns on global pollination or population of pollinators, and they hope that with the lowering of MRLs that they will protect global population of pollinators. The process started in June 2020, and the consultation with World Trade Organization members ended in early September 2022. If the regulation is implemented, what we are expecting, then the entry into force is probably in the first quarter of 2023, and the lowered MRLs would apply from 3 years after the entry into force in early 2026. The European Commission has already said that they are now doing this for these two substances, but they have already communicated other substances that will follow a similar approach. So in the Farm to Fork strategy, they announced that they want to lower MRLs and consider environmental factors for substances that are no longer approved in the European Union. Trading partners have responded in the WTO process, and 19 countries raised concerns. On top, this topic is discussed heavily in the relevant committees in the World Trade Organization, namely the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, and in the SPS, the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Committee, and also in other agricultural committees. So many countries have raised concerns, particularly also South Africa, who has alluded to unique sustainability objectives and challenges, and that South Africa has high pest and disease pressure due to a combination of heat, humidity, and moisture from different weeds, pests, and fungi, and that they need to address those by using the tools that they have available and use diverse methods, tools, and technologies in order to farm sustainably and to meet a growing demand for food and feed in a world of climate change. They also raised that the measure may restrict trade to the European Union for their agricultural products and will disrupt production and negatively impact livelihoods in South Africa, particularly for small and rural producers. They also ask for science and risk-based decision-making driven by the available data to enhance sustainability in agriculture. Many other countries responded similarly and also alluded to that this way forward, the unilateral approach from the European Union to lower MRLs is not in line with WTO procedures. So this discussion is ongoing, but we still believe that the European Union will move ahead. So what do we as industry say about that? So we advocate and strongly stress every time we have the chance to speak that maximum residue limits for pesticides are a trading standard that ensure that are driven by good agricultural practice and that ensure that the food that is traded is safe for consumption. It allows for a level playing field for all farmers, not only in the European Union, but globally. MRLs are not an appropriate tool to tackle environmental challenges globally, because as I mentioned before, MRLs are not, the level of residue on harvested crops does not correlate with the exposure to or the risk to non-target organisms or the environment. It is important that trade is enabled between the European Union and its global trading partners in order to meet sustainability and food security needs globally. We also want to challenge that the European Union is moving away from international agreed trade principles and rules and is implementing de facto non-tariff trade barriers. We also encourage the European Union and all its trading partners to address and discuss global environmental concerns at multilateral fora. So that is what we are proposing and what we are advocating for. I want to highlight again, with the notification of these two substances, it is just setting the precedents. So even if farmers or countries are not impacted too much with the lowering of the MRLs for these two substances, other substances will follow. So this means that de facto, on the long run, farmers in South Africa may lose tools in their toolbox based on policy that is developed outside of South Africa, namely in the European Union. And that there is a risk that the European Union on the long run will drive what is globally registerable for pesticides and uses in other countries. Also, the European Union approach makes everything less predictable because they go on a case-by-case basis. And we need predictability for the farmers and for the traders in order to allow trade of agricultural commodities. With that, I hope that I haven't bothered you with too much details and that you enjoyed this. But I want to come back to one of my previous slides. As I mentioned before, there's no one size that fits all. We all want to have more sustainable food systems, but different regions have different needs and need different tools in their toolbox to farm sustainable. We also need predictability, and we have the competent authorities around the world that can evaluate the tools that are needed to farm sustainably in their jurisdictions. So I would like to encourage you, if you have the opportunity to speak to stakeholders in the European Union and elsewhere, please explain how farming in South Africa works and how farming is sustainable in South Africa, how the tools are registered, that pollinator risk has been assessed, and that pollinator risk can be managed in South Africa, and that those substances can be safely used in South Africa. But if you want to learn more about MRLs, there is a training module released soon that we have developed within CropLife International with all food safety and MRL and trade experts. It consists of 7 modules, 7 quizzes, and frequently asked questions document. If you do those modules online, it's an online training, it's free of charge. And if you complete it, you can also download a certificate of completion. So if you want to dive into the topic of MRLs deeper, please stay tuned and we can send you the link soon. I thank you for your attention and I'm ready to take your questions.
So Vipka will be joining us during the Q&A, so if you have your questions, keep them handy. For those of you who are joining us virtually, and if you cannot see your chat function, please can you refresh your browser. Refreshing your browser should bring up the chat function, and that'll enable you to get your questions across to us. So the final bit of the introductory session for today is going to be by myself. And we really just want to wrap up the EU Green Deal part and bring in a little bit of a South African perspective before we take the tea break. I think the first important point that we want to make is that as the industry association, we are convinced that having a regulatory process is non-negotiable. We cannot allow our products to be entering markets without some form of regulation. However, we do need a regulatory process that takes into account the impact of our products that would ensure the health of the consumer, ensure the health of persons who are handling our products, and of course ensuring the health of the environment. These components are absolutely critical to any regulatory process. As we said in the beginning as well, the European Union is well within its rights to set new laws and new standards for its own citizens, but certainly they need to take into account other role players and trading partners and what is required in other countries around the world in terms of food production. So we've already heard from the speakers today that it's inevitable that there is going to be an impact on our local farmers and our local food production from the introduction of the EU Green Deal, its farm to fork strategy, and various other bits of legislation that are going to be supporting their strategy. It also seems very likely that import tolerances and straight-out MRLs for certain products are going to go down to level of quantification or to be revoked altogether if that product is not currently registered and used in the European Union. It's not all doom and gloom. We heard from Tracy that there could very well be opportunities for increased trade as long as we can meet the new entry requirements. And the industry and CropLife is already fairly well advanced down the route. So we're using the example here of integrated pest management. You've all heard it from various training modules, from responsible use, from stewardship in general, that IPM is a very important part of the association and the industry's drive already to make our industry more sustainable. So as far as we're concerned, yes, there are risks coming. There can also be opportunities, but we're already fairly well down the route on coming up with mitigating circumstances. And just to remind you all, I'm not going to give you an IPM lecture, but just remember the CropLife position on IPM is only use the amount of product that you use when it's absolutely necessary, and you need to use as many different tools out of your toolbox as possible. In a nutshell, that is our position. There are local regulatory challenges, however. Let's not steer clear of that. And we believe this is going to exacerbate the problems of either losing products or having import tolerances and MRLs revoked on our local farmers. To bring a new plant protection solution to the South African market, some of you are going to beat me up at the tea break and said I can add another 3 years on this, but I've been fairly generous in saying we have to have multiple years of field trials in different geographic locations of our country to get the data that we can submit to the registrar. And then when it hits the registrar's office, as I said, optimistically, you've got to wait another 3 years before that new product is registered and you can start marketing and selling it. So we've got a double whammy here. We are potentially facing the loss of products from the market, and we are not getting the concurrent rapid introduction of new technologies and new tools for our farmers coming in. I also believe we need to be fair to our local regulators. They are trying to regulate an industry on one hand, and on the other hand, there is more and more pressure from outside the country, but also internal pressure from different groups. We have many groups out there who believe that we can still feed the world without pesticides. I don't think many of you in this room would share that impression, but we need to be fair to our registrar that the pressure that is coming from that side is immense. However, you've also heard from some other presenters this morning. We recognize that, but what we really request is that any regulator, not just our regulator, uses recognized and peer-reviewed data before they make decisions on which products need to be withdrawn from our local market and taken away from our farmers. We also hope that regulators are considering the socio-economic impact on our farmers, on our people, and on our food security before they decide to take tools away from our farmers. The EU Green Deal and also the aims and aspirations of our regulators to only have safe products on the market is very noble, but we certainly need local conditions to be taken into account. We have some unique crop pest combinations here that need unique molecules that might not be used elsewhere in the world. And we are also very much on the borderline in terms of food security. The Food Security Index gets published every year, and South Africa doesn't rank too highly at the moment. We are often victims of the vagaries of our climate. So we really need to be talking to our regulators and just reminding them that our unique crop pest combinations in this country need to be looked at in a different light. We cannot just bow to international or local pressure to remove certain molecules. Another concern that we have, and we have some of our members in the room today, is that the owners of new plant protection solutions are running a business. They have to decide where they're going to take their meager resources, where they're going to do trials, and where they're going to register products. And if we end up being a country that is not attractive in terms of the regulatory environment, we're not going to have new technologies being brought to this country. Now you add that on to the risk of losing molecules, losing MRLs, losing import tolerances. If we then don't have a source of new solutions coming in, again, just piling up against our farmers. So after the session's break, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the local regulatory environment and other concerns that we have for our primary producers of food in our country. But I just want to leave you with the thoughts, as the industry association, and our members. We don't just sit in the corner and complain that there's all these new regulations coming from Europe, everything's piling up against us. And one of the key areas I just want to talk to you briefly on is the activities of the Strategic Agricultural Inputs Forum. Those of you who know the local regulation, Act 36 of 1947, there are a number of other industry associations whose members are impacted by Act 36, such as the animal health, the animal feeds, the fertilizer producers, of course ourselves. Now the common thread with all of us, as I said, is we have to operate under Act 36. Getting a registration under Act 36 is our right to operate. No registration, no sales. So we collectively came together in a loose forum, and I'm very pleased to say that through multiple efforts over the last few months, 6 weeks ago, we signed with the DG of Dalrad, DG Ramasodi. We signed the so-called gap analysis. This was a lot of work that was done to sit with the registrar's office, understand where bottlenecks are, understand where resources are required, because you need a baseline. If you want to improve something, you've got to have that baseline. So that work has been accepted, signed off by the DG, and this opens the doors for us now to talk with the registrar and Dalrad on how we're going to improve the regulatory process, particularly in our interest for plant protection solutions in South Africa. We still got a long way to go, but we do thank and we recognize Dalrad's willingness to work with us so that we can improve the regulatory process. I must be honest, this is not going to be an overnight solution, whereas the EU Green Deal and potential negative impact is looming. So we do need to consider that as a potential risk. So we're now going to open up the floor to any questions. And also a reminder, please, if you're joining us virtually, if you can refresh your browser if you're not seeing the chat box and type your questions in, please. Thank you. There is a roving mic that will be shared with you if you have a question. Thank you. No questions so far. Do I have to do like a Gerard and start asking some questions? Yes, we have a hand up. And sorry, there's no ways I'm going to remember everybody's name, so if you could give your name at the start of your question, that'll be great for the minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. It's Lindy Bennick from Hortgrow. I'm going to make a few comments more than a question, since no one else has come up, and I know that Paul will be talking later, and Kobus, so some of those things will come out in it. We've heard a lot, and thanks to CropLife for organizing this conference, from the opening speaker up until the last speaker, about the impact that the EU Green Deal is going to have on South Africa. I just want to make a few comments. I mean, we all know, we've been watching the space. The EU Green Deal started around 2019, where they started talking EU Green Deal and the farm to fork issue. The issue of mirror clauses is something that's becoming more recently, and if you really look into it, there's nothing out there that's been taken forward by the EU on an engagement with its trading partners. There's still a lot of engagement within the EU on whether it should go forward or not. Yes, on the antibiotic issue, it's gone forward, and yes, they're now talking about the impact on future on import tolerances. Just to say a few things, we know the EU Green Deal is there, but we've already had the impact of loss of chemicals since way back then, when the EU took the approach of doing from 396 to 1107 of taking hazard-based approach. And we've had an ongoing loss of chemicals in that time, with most of those chemicals dropping to LOD levels. Yes, in some cases there are import tolerances, but not all. However, we still, in many cases, can use those products and export at below LOD levels. So that's still very valuable for us. The other thing that I seem to feel at the moment is everyone talks about the impact of the EU Green Deal. I just want to put another thing on the table. It's already a very unfair playing field, because imports coming into South Africa, EU imports, can meet EU Codex or SAMRLs. And exports from South Africa must meet already the stringent reduced EU MRLs. So there's a lot, if one is talking mirror clauses and the whole issue of reciprocity, then we should be formulating an SA position and saying, we need to look at this definitely closer and say, if this is going to be imposed on us, what must we look at to make sure that there's a level playing field? So I'm just making those comments because if you take, for instance, thiamethoxam, we already on apples have an SA MRL of 0.02, which does not allow us to use it at 0.3, which is the EU MRL. If it drops to 0.01, we can meet that requirement. So there are other issues we need to look at and not just focus on what the EU is pushing. We need to be pushing back and saying what position must we have and how do we take those points forward.
Thank you, Lindy, and it's a great opportunity for us to reinforce why we're all sitting here today. Industry, for sure, goes back to regulators and trade partners around the world and highlights where we see there are concerns. However, you'll see that there's a lot of grower associations represented today. That is the voice of the farmer that we need. You heard it in the introduction with Samira, is collectively we need to take our concerns up the ladder, exactly as you say, Lindy. We need to have the African Union aware of our concerns. We need the EU to hear about our concerns. They need to understand that policies that are wonderful for them can have unintended consequences for our local farmers. Yes, a boer kan maak 'n plan, and some of our larger farmers can change and bop and weave and be flexible. But we also need to remember our emerging farmers in this country might not have that flexibility to change. So yes, we know that it's been coming. We know there's been flexibility. We also need to remember we're heading towards a bit of a perfect storm. We could lose a lot more molecules coming up. We could lose a lot more import tolerances without replacement products coming in. Let's not forget that. And let's not also forget good agricultural practice and resistance management. It's easy to say, yeah, we've still got a few products for that pest crop combination, but if you've only got two of them and they're the same mode of action, where we're going to be in terms of resistance management. So we need to protect the toolbox of our local producers, and we need to raise the awareness and have the collective voice from all of us here today that are going to get our voice heard up the line. I'm very pleased to say that on the RSVPs we got, there is a great contingent of people from DTRC, Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. So maybe some of them might have some questions raised in the chat for us just now, but we have included all role players so that our voice and the concerns of our farmers can be heard. Thank you, Lindy. We've got a question right in the back, please.
The Chairman, yes, I would like to just to make a comment. Yes, organic farming in South Africa is how can you say, a great word in South Africa, but also a challenge in South Africa. If you look at the soil qualities and the soil fertility in South Africa, compared to the rest of the countries, especially if you compare it to African countries, where you're sitting with percentage of carbon above 2 to 3, 4% compared to South Africa. Mostly of the soil quality or fertility is lesser than 1%, even lesser than 0.5%. So if you take that in consideration with the weather circumstances and also the water quality and the water scarcity, then South Africa stands in front of a huge challenge to be part of this Green Deal. And I think, personally, I think we have to take hands and see how we can manage this challenge in South Africa, because we had actually more challenges than other countries to make this dream come true around about this Green Deal. So organic farming in South Africa coming from long ago, but the farmers who want to change their mindset to become more organic is to take in consideration the yield outcome and also the food prices. So from international point of view, I think on the financial side or subsidized according to what the benefits of other countries had, according to South Africa, we don't have that kind of benefits. I think it will be a quite a challenging task for us in South Africa, together with CropLife.
Good. Well, thank you for those comments. And I'll have a similar reply to what I gave to Lindy, is exactly why we're here. Our colleagues at DTRC, our colleagues in CropLife Africa Middle East who engage with the European Union, even direct engagement ourselves with the EU. These are the messages that need to get up there and give examples of where the noble targets are more than likely not going to be attainable by us in South Africa and not going to be applicable to many of our agricultural situations. So thank you for sharing. And of course, the entire team is here. We will be engaging with people after this event, not just with anyone who makes comments, but anybody who would like to give insight afterwards. Please don't be shy. We can include comments, we can take good suggestions as to how we engage with trading partners and other regulators. Do we have anybody else? I've got nothing coming in on the live chat. No questions that side, great. Tracy, I'm going to come to you. I very much liked your slide saying that there are opportunities if we can comply down the line with the new regulations. Do you have any suggestions for us as to how we can collectively, as all the role players, make sure that we do comply so that we do take advantage of those opportunities that this is going to bring us?
Wow. Yeah, I think there's many people in this room that's better placed than myself to answer that. Obviously, it's on the one end there's the ability to comply, and then on the other end there's still being competitive. So, I mean, I think apart from what you're already doing here, I think a combined discussion, a combined effort across all industries, and not even just horticulture, all industries in South African agriculture, to get things like the Registrar's Office operating faster, to get new replacement products. Obviously, our farmers have to manage the pests. They have a challenge there, so whatever we can enable them with to do that within what the regulations will allow is ultimately what one is aiming for.
Great, thank you. Wibke, are you with us?
Yes, hello, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I have a question for you, Wibke. You've made it very clear that the CropLife position on environmental considerations being used when setting MRLs is, in our opinion, not correct. How has the European Union responded to that position to date? Has it been any positive feedback? Do they understand the position that environmental considerations take place during the evaluation of the active ingredient dossier or the formulated product? Or are they wanting to continue along that avenue?
So the European Union, to our knowledge, will respond to all the member states that have submitted comments in the TBT notification. I don't know whether those comments will be made public or not, probably not, but maybe we hear them through the governments. In public fora, they continue to state that they will move ahead with the implementation of this policy because according to their analysis, it is legal and it is needed. But they have, so this week there was the Codex Alimentarius Commission meeting where the European Union also brought up their approach and want to include also environmental factors in the consideration for Codex. But member states opposed that the environmental factors are part of the Codex mandate. The Codex mandate is clearly on food safety and to facilitate fair trade. And therefore, it was this time they were not successful in introducing this into Codex in the discussion. So they will move ahead. They have a lot of pressure from their farmers in Europe. The farmers are losing tools in Europe. The regulation 1107, as one of the people from the audience have already mentioned, it's very strict and there have been many active ingredients being lost. So the farmers are losing tools and other farmers outside the European Union still have access to those tools. So the European Union clearly uses this kind of policy to establish a level playing field for their farmers in Europe. And I think this needs to be kept in mind when engaging in this topic with the European Union. So it's a competitive angle in this policy. It's not only the food environmental safety and food safety discussion that is center here. And therefore, I think it's very important that you raise it with the European Union and explain how you farm, because the Brussels bubble is very special, let's say. They have no idea how farming works. Maybe not a good idea how it works in the European Union, but definitely not a good idea how it works outside in the European Union. So therefore, I can only encourage you to explain the pressure, the work that you do in South Africa, how you farm, what it means to be sustainable, the tools that you use them responsibly, and these to explain and make that case and illustrate that to stakeholders in Brussels.
Thank you, Vipka. I think the message is clear, and one of the key reasons we're here today is to take that message up the ladder. We have a question in the room, please.
Thanks. Henny Groenewald from Biosafety South Africa. We've heard a lot about the chemicals, and you discussed a little bit about Act 36, but I think we should not forget about the genetic-based solutions that are out there as well, both on the side of, the possibility of reducing actually some of these things that we're discussing in terms of chemical use, but then also the actual sustainability things that we discussed that are the aims of the Green Deal. So my question related to that then is if there's any reference in any of those documents to the use of genetics, and specifically something like genome editing, and then related to that, in my experience, there's a lot of agreement and discussion. We agree on the potential solutions of these things. But the one thing that's lacking in South Africa is the urgency of addressing these things, especially at the policy level. So I would love to see a little bit more urgency in getting, and be proactive around these things. Thanks.
Thank you, Annie. I think, Chantal and I would be sharing your sentiment of some urgency around decisions on genome editing. I'm going to ask Prof. Matthews. Are you with us, Prof?
Indeed I am. I've been following the discussion and it's extremely interesting.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us and for your presentation earlier. So I hope you heard that question. It's all about, is there mention or an effort in the EU Green Deal to promote GMO crops or biotech, let's use the correct terminology, more aggressively?
A matter which is very live in the discussion at the present time. I think you'll be aware that there was a decision of the European Court of Justice some years ago which determined that the regulation of so-called new breeding technologies should fall under the extremely strict regulation of genetically modified organisms. The Commission has agreed to take this up, and we are expecting it to come forward with a proposal that would suggest a more lenient regulatory regime for these new breeding technologies. But that hasn't yet come, so it's part of what we are expecting in the legislative program, perhaps over the next 12 months or so.
And while we have you, Prof, you outlined in your presentation quite an extensive list of parallel legislation that is coming along with the EU Green Deal. You've also heard from Vipka encouraging us to go back to Brussels with our argumentation as to why we could have some negative impacts on our farmers locally. Is there still a chance to impact some of that pending parallel legislation, or has that ship sailed?
I would think that the European Union is very open to dialogue. I have to say, of course, that I am an outsider in terms of the policy process, so I'm obviously not here speaking on behalf of the European Commission or policymakers. But I think they are aware of the need to try to bring other trading countries with them to the extent possible. there is, I think Vibeke was quite right to highlight, there is this competitive angle, which is an important driver of the policy debate within the European Union, where European farmers have argued that they are not allowed to use particular active substances which their competitors outside the European Union have access to. So that competitive part is important. But I think there is also a genuine concern that we need to move more urgently and faster to address some of these global environmental problems. And obviously, in the case of the two substances we've been talking about, the decline in pollinators is a worldwide phenomenon. So to the extent that you and South Africans can say that you are aware and addressing this issue, that you have your own policies in place, my understanding is that there is still that opportunity to present that evidence and to make an argument for exemption, if you like, from the very strict rules. I've said lowering MRLs and import tolerances to zero. That was, of course, a shorthand for the LOQ, but basically there is, I think, still a door open there to make the case that you have policies in place to address these issues. So the MRL is not the appropriate instrument for you. But again, that does require collecting that data and presenting that case. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Prof, which is fully aligned with Vibke's recommendation, and why we're all sitting here in this room today is to start preparing ourselves to collect that data. Do we have any other questions in the room? Lindy, let's get the microphone so the virtual people can hear us.
I'm just going to add to my comment, but coming back to the comment you posed to Vibke and her related comment. So at the moment, we're talking mirror clauses, but we need to understand what we mean by that. If we are saying that only products used in the EU, authorized in the EU, can be used, then the EU also needs to consider your comment about we have many products, new chemistries we won't have in South Africa because we haven't got those registered yet. So by implication, we are saying that if it's reciprocity, and if you impose the same requirements, they cannot use products that they may have to use when they are exporting. So I think the whole thing needs to be really one gets the feeling the EU is pushing their agenda. They're not really taking into consideration, I think there are players in EU that are cautious and aware of it. But there's other issues that need to, and what it highlights to me, especially in preparing for this conference and some of the panel questions, we really direly need an SA position. And we need to understand what issues have already been raised at government levels by our government colleagues and counterparts that are in such discussions. And we need to have at least an initial attempt for an SA position. And underpinning that, we need to have a consultative advisory forum or platform involving the government parties involved, involving industry, and I don't only mean producers, I mean ag chem industry, and other relevant stakeholders that need to contribute to that position. Once we have that, we can then start seeing how we can influence our African counterparts or SADC or BRICS counterparts.
Absolutely, Lindy, and again, that's why we're all here today. This is the first step in we don't want to own the process as CropLife, but we see it's important. We've got the experts all together. We can be the facilitator. So we see ourselves as the facilitator to establish that. Sorry for using the word baseline, but we need that basic position, and then we can see the areas that need to be addressed, highlighted to people who are making these policy decisions. Fully aligned. That's why we're all here today. Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Do we have Samira with us? No, Samira's not with us. Okay. I just wanted to ask Samira to highlight something she said in her introduction. This is going to be one of more such interactions and activities with role players throughout the continent. So you heard Samira talking about CropLife Africa Middle East's efforts. So these efforts will be duplicated in other countries who are also exporting into the European Union. So this is just the start of quite a big strategy of CropLife on the African continent to make sure the voices of the African farmers are heard and policies and decisions taken in other parts of the world are not having too much of a negative impact on us. So if you do have interests in other African countries and you want to be part of those future discussions, please get hold of somebody on the CropLife South Africa team, or we have Evelyn and Les from CropLife Africa Middle East with us, so reach out to us during the breaks or afterwards, please. Well, if there are no further questions on the floor, I'm seeing nothing coming in from the live chats. I don't know if you're seeing something different at the back. No live chats. So thank you for your attention. I believe we've set the stage quite nicely as to why we're all here. And then we're going to dive into a few other things which are unique to South Africa perhaps, but also some other unintended consequences that haven't been discussed to date.